This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you Episode 1 of Season 2, that being the year 1909, of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, January 2nd, 1909. I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford 114 years ago as we read. The first section on January 2nd, 1909 was the About Town section. At a recent meeting of the Westford Athletic Association, it was voted to hold the annual dance and all the social gatherings that cluster around such times on Wednesday evening, January 20th. The Salem Cadet Orchestra will furnish music, and that means that everyone who has life for the joyous of these times will be there. The Salem Cadets had a long and distinguished history. They were also referred to as the Second Corps of Cadets and were founded in 1785 as an officers' training corps. They served in the Civil War, and today they are what has become Battery B of the 101st Field Artillery of the Massachusetts National Guard. Henry Barker of Quincy has sold his oak woodlot on Oak Hill to F.O. Dutton of South Chelmsford. This is the lot that took the owner and one of the assessors nearly a day to locate, for although close to the civilization of several active stone quarries, yet stone bounds to this lot were as scarce as in the Great Sahara Desert. A revised and more detailed account of the recent sidetracking of a heavy freight at Brookside discloses the fact that the engine ran onto the Fletcher track for a carload of stone from H.E. Fletcher and Company for the Boston and Maine Railroad, for which they were in a hurry. That, after returning to the main track, they left the switch open and ran with full speed onto the Fletcher track. That they were unable to back the train off, that they were delayed several hours waiting for help, and that the engineer was discharged by the management of the Boston and Maine Railroad for carelessness in running over an open switch. How did you enjoy trying to reach Taylor's Corner on a recent evening, starting from Graniteville and going by way of the Rapid Transit main line to North Chelmsford and finding that they had decided to wait an hour while they cut out a trip? Well, if you don't feel like answering, let me ask the mill help at Brookside, who shivered in the cold. This was another shot at the Lowell and Fitchburg Electric trolley service. At the Unitarian Church, Sunday, December 20th, everything was Christmas: decorations, song, prayer, and sermon, and the Sunday school, after the usual devotional exercises, and believing that, quote, faith without works is dead, end quote, decided to infringe upon the long-established ordinary and proceeded to exemplify the Santa Claus Act on the principle that the Sabbath was made for man. Reverend Benjamin H. Bailey proceeded to interpret all good messages from books, stories, anecdotes, and the leaves of memory, and in this entertaining vein led on to Christmas greetings. All in the Sunday school had an individual remembrance, and many of those long shut in by sickness from the social sunshine of life were remembered, regardless of church affiliations, as well as some who have to be cared for by the guardian ministrations of the town farm. The town farm was located on Town Farm Road, and at this time was in actual use as a home for indigenous town citizens. Wallace Johnson has been harvesting ice on the wing, as it were, between freezing and thawing, having filled the ice houses at Westford Center with ice 9 inches thick from Burgess Pond. The ice houses at the pond are not yet ready for ice, nor the ice for the ice houses. Jerry Decatur, principal of the grammar school at Graniteville, who has been spending these vacation days in familiarizing old associations, sprang a surprise by starting out one day and visiting home. This was one of those vague possibility visits, but offset by a strong element of improbability, hence the great surprise. Jerry Decatur, I believe, lived at the Decatur home, which is now referred to as the Pelatiah Fletcher home. It's a colonial home on Lowell Road. The next section is the Fortnightly Club. The Fortnightly Club of North Westford will hold a debate at the Wright Schoolhouse Friday evening, January 9th, on the subject resolved that small fruit farming is more profitable than market gardening. For the affirmative, Horace E. Gould and Samuel L. Taylor. The negative, Hiram Dane and John F. Chandler. Carloads of folks, electrical ones, electrical carloads, not electrical folks, went to Lowell the days and evenings of the play The Merry Widow, given at the Opera House the early part of the week, just as though there were not such widows in Westford. But then distance and enchantment, you know, are sometimes easily tickled. The Merry Widow was referred to here as the operetta composed by Franz Lehar. It was first performed in Vienna in 1905. It was translated into English and began a run in London in June of 1907, and then it was produced in this country by Henry Wilson Savage as the light opera and performed at the Lowell Opera House on December 29th, 30th, and 31st after tremendously successful runs in both New York and at the Tremont Theater in Boston. The Lowell Sun of December 24th, 1908, referred to it as, quote, the biggest hit in stage history. The next section is called Exercises. The Stony Brook School, with its usual aptitude and inherent intuition for observing the anniversary advent of the comprehensive life, gave the salutary Christmas exercises at the afternoon session of the school, Friday, December 18th, with all the usual skyrocket brilliancy. Edward Reed acted as Toastmaster for Santa Claus and had his dispensations so well tabulated that everyone felt that they were a notable factor in the celebration, and the harvest for the Christmas tree was the condensed act of reaping what has been sown there, being no, quote, grapes or thorns or figs of thistles, end quote, which is a quote from Matthew chapter 7, verse 16. The teacher, Miss Anna Mellon, M-E-L-L-E-N, who has charged for many years, has got the working efficiency of the school itemized principles of first foundations. Although the day was one of Emerson's, quote, announced by all the trumpets of the sky arrives the snow, end quote, yet there were 26 visitors present. That quote from Emerson is the first line and a half of his poem, The Snowstorm, that was published in 1841. Samuel Taylor, in addition to being a daily Bible reader, was also a big fan of Emerson. He quotes him quite often. Robert G. Patton of Amesbury, Deputy Tax Commissioner, made an official visit to the assessors and collector last Saturday afternoon to inspect the books and methods of the assessors and for mutual exchange of ask and answer questions with the collector. He had little criticism to offer other than what is common throughout the state, a conservative tendency to cling to old, accustomed methods long after the command has been given from the tax commissioner's office to readjust in harmony with modern law and conditions. It is expected that omitted taxes in the state this year will be very near $40,000. Of this sum, over $10,000 is in Middlesex County. Now, those sums are as presented in the paper of January 7th, but in the paper of January 16th, 1909, they were corrected. They should have read $40,000 for the state and $40 million for the state and $10 million for Middlesex County. Of this sum, the town of Westford is credited with the sum of $28.24 omitted taxes assessed in December. In other words, our tax collector who was Leonard Wheeler, was very efficient at collecting all the taxes that are due on schedule. The next section is the Forge Village section. A special musicale service will be given in Forge Mission House next Sunday evening at 7 o'clock in commemoration of the 6th anniversary of the Vested Choir. The Sunday school will meet as usual at 3:30, but the afternoon service will be substituted by that in the evening. This is Mission House, is of course what we refer to now as St. Andrew's Mission. Mr. and Mrs. Bennett and family of Bradford, England, arrived on the Ivernia last week, Thursday, and will make their home here. So people were still immigrating to Westford from England in the early 1900s, mostly to work in the mills. William C. Precious was taken very sick Tuesday night. The physician was summoned, and for a while he suffered intensely, but now seems a little better. Mrs. William Flanagan, who was seriously ill of pleurisy, is at time of writing somewhat better. Funeral services for Mrs. Ellen MacDonald were held in St. Catherine's Church last Saturday morning. A funeral mass was celebrated by Reverend J.J. McNamara. Burial was in St. Catherine's Cemetery. The next section is the Graniteville section. A high mass was celebrated in St. Catherine's Church on Christmas morning by Reverend J.J. McNamara at 9:45 o'clock. The full choir was in attendance and under the direction of Miss Mary F. Hanley sang the Mass in the sixth tone by Dumont. The Adeste Fidelis was also sung, the solos being sustained by Miss Hanley and Robert J. McCarthy. The Mass was very largely attended. Mr. and Mrs. William H. Wall of Lynn, formerly of this village, left Boston last Monday morning bound for San Francisco, California, where they intended to reside in the future. Mr. Wall will join his brother Fred in Frisco, who has been enjoying the beautiful climate of California for over a year. Among the visitors noticed here during the holidays were Mr. and Mrs. Frank McClenna of Hinsdale, New Hampshire, Thomas Payne, James Knox and friends from Beverly, James and Anna Harrington of Leominster, and Albert R. Derone of East Pepperell. The annual Christmas tree exercises were held in St. Catherine's Church on Wednesday evening, December 23rd at 7:30, and were very largely attended. A large tree had been tastefully arranged by the Sunday school teachers and was loaded down with gifts for the children. Through the generosity of the Abbott Worsted Company, who sent a substantial check, the Sunday school teachers were enabled to make a fine showing, both as to decorating and in the line of presents for the children, for each child received a pretty gift of some sort. The parishioners of St. Catherine's Church are very grateful for the kind and thoughtful act of the Abbott Worsted Company. All the children that took part did finely in their respective parts, which showed the result of their careful training under the direction of Miss Catherine Conley, who had entire charge, assisted by Miss Harriet O'Brien, Miss Fanny McCarthy, and the other teachers of St. Catherine's Church Sunday School. Joe Wall was the Santa Claus and kept the children in good spirits from start to finish. The next section is called Christmas Tree Exercises. It's quite obvious that this was one of the traditions through all the churches and schools in Westford 100 years ago. The Graniteville Methodist Episcopal Church was filled to the doors Thursday evening, December 24th, when the annual Christmas tree exercises were given by the children of the Sunday school. The genial superintendent, Wesley O. Hawks, has been the prime mover in this affair, and being aided by Mrs. Charles H. Wright, who drilled the children, and Miss Emily Prynne, who had charge of the musical end of the program, the result was a success in every way. The Sunday school children were handsomely remembered by the Abbott Worsted Company, who presented to Superintendent Hawks a substantial check to be used for presents for the children. Mr. Hawks turned the money over to a committee composed of Mrs. Walter C. Wright and Mrs. Lucy A. Blood, who showed excellent judgment in their purchases, for it seemed that every child got just what he wanted and not one was forgotten. The tree itself, which was a fine specimen, was the gift of J. Everett Woods. The pastor, Reverend Samuel H. Armand, was remembered with a well-filled purse being his portion. He thanked them sincerely in a few well-chosen words, his remarks being thoroughly in accord with the Christmas spirit. Walter Shattuck was a lively, up-to-date Santa Claus, and although his beard got tangled up in the tree at one stage of the game, it did not change his good nature in the least, and, besides, it pleased the children immensely. The entertainment, as presented by the children, proved highly pleasing, which showed the result of their careful training under the able supervision of Mrs. C.H. Wright and Miss Emily Prynne. The next section is the Westford Center section. There was a large family gathering at the home of J.H. Decatur on the Lowell Road Christmas Day. There were 16 at the dinner table. There was a Christmas tree for the children. Mr. Decatur, owing to 2 paralytic strokes, has been an invalid for the last 7 years, and for the past 2 or 3 years confined to the house, and this was a notable event in his quiet life, debarred from its former busy activities. This was the Decatur home, now referred to as the Pelletiah Fletcher House on Lowell Road. Mr. and Mrs. John P. Wright's 2 little daughters, Frances and Alice, still in quarantine with scarlet fever, with a trained nurse in attendance. Charles L. Hildreth, who has been so ill for so many weeks, is much improved and enjoying seeing visitors on Christmas Day. Frank C. Wright and Samuel H. Balch, the RFD, the Rural Free Delivery Carriers, who covered their routes on Christmas Day, carrying the Christmas mail, had New Year's Day to themselves. No mail was delivered that day. Mr. and Mrs. Oscar R. Spaulding entertained a large family party on Christmas Day. Mr. and Mrs. Henry M. Wright and son Livingston of Quincy spent part of Mr. Wright's vacation from teaching at Nahum H. Wright's, Henry's parents. The Herbert V. Hildreths spent several days, including Christmas, with the Fred A. Hildreths in Malden. Fred Hildreth was Herbert's father. The increased use of the library by the children has made it desirable to have a room arranged especially for them, as is common in the larger libraries. The former reference room has been chosen for this purpose and will now be devoted to the children's use. A large number of juvenile books will be placed there. In the reading room, shelves have been added for the reference books so that this part of the library's usefulness need not suffer by the change. It is expected that the new arrangement will be finished before the schools open. May E. Day is at home from her first Christmas vacation at Mount Holyoke College. She would go on to become the Westford head librarian for many years. Mr. and Mrs. Pearl Harmon have closed their home on the Littleton Road and have gone to spend the next 2 months in Lowell. They left behind them in the parsonage barn their faithful family horse, to be used and cared for by Mr. Marshall. This will enable him, not to mention the lady of the parsonage, to get about more conveniently for a time among their widely scattered parish. The next section is called Congregational. The annual Christmas tree exercises for the Sunday school at the Congregational Church were held at the vestry on Christmas Eve. Owing to considerable sickness among the children, the exercises were expected to be of a simple character, but they proved with all their wealth of glad Christmas spirit to be most enjoyable to old and young, and much to the credit of Superintendent and Mrs. Houghton G. Osgood. A stereopticon entertainment in charge of Mr. Marshall came first, depicting scenes from the childhood of Christ, also pictures illustrating the story of Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, and lastly that poem dear to the heart of every child, "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," was read by Mr. Marshall and pictured on the screen. Santa Claus appeared and dispensed gifts and boxes of candy to all from the well-laden tree. Last but not least was the presentation to Mr. and Mrs. Marshall of a purse of $40. The vestry was effectively trimmed with evergreen and red Christmas bells. The poem, The Night Before Christmas, was written by Clement Clark Moore, who died in 1863. It was also called A Visit from St. Nicholas. And it was written in 1822, quite a long time ago, and was first published the following year. His father, Benjamin Moore, Bishop of New York, officiated at the inauguration of George Washington. The evening service at this church last Sunday was largely attended and somewhat unique in character. It was a question box meeting, a good list of questions upon various subjects that had previously been solicited and gathered by the prayer meeting committee were answered at more or less length by the pastor with characteristic good sense and comprehension. Miss Edna Ferguson sang a solo, Abide With Me. At the morning service, the Christmas musical program of the previous Sunday was repeated by a full choir under the direction of choir leader Miss Carrie Atwood. And that's the news in Westford for the week ending January 2nd, 1909. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Nick Woodbury of Westford Cat for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Westford Wardsman at our website, museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.